He found two nearly dead Apache women in the cold, the choice that changed his life. The morning had started quietly, colder than usual, with a thin layer of frost covering the rancher's land. Every branch and blade of grass shimmered under the weak light of the rising sun. He had been riding through his usual path, checking the fences and making sure the livestock were safe. The winter had been harsh this year, and even the strongest animals were struggling with the biting cold. His breath came in white clouds as he rode steadily along the snow-covered trail, the familiar sound of hooves breaking the silence. He had grown up on this land, learning to read the signs of the seasons, the moods of the animals, and the subtle changes in the sky. He knew that winter could be unforgiving, that it could surprise even the most prepared person. Yet, he had never seen anything like what caught his eyes that morning. At first, he thought it was a shadow, moving strangely among the trees. But as he got closer, his heart began to race. There, lying almost completely still in the snow, were two women. They were nearly hidden among the snow-covered bushes, their small frames trembling, their faces pale and frozen. Their clothes were thin, clearly not enough for the cold they had endured, and their hair was matted with frost. Something inside him tightened, a mix of shock, fear, and a sudden rush of responsibility. He could tell at a glance that they were on the edge of life and death. For a moment he paused, unsure. The cold was dangerous, and the terrain was rough. But something stronger than hesitation pushed him forward. He dismounted and ran the last few steps, his boots sinking into the cold snow. Kneeling beside them, he felt the chill of their bodies. They were alive, but barely. Their breathing was shallow, almost like whispers of air. One of the women had her eyes half open, staring blankly at the sky, while the other was completely still, her face pressed against the snow. Without thinking, he pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around them as best he could. The cold bit at his fingers as he gently checked for signs of life. He could feel their fragile pulses under his hands, weak but steady. His mind raced. There was no time to waste. If he didn't act now, the frost and cold could take them before anyone else arrived. He looked around for help, but the ranch was miles from the nearest neighbor. The thought of leaving them there even for a moment was unbearable. He had always believed in helping anyone in need, and this moment was a test of that belief. He knew the choice he was about to make would not be easy. Carrying them to safety would be exhausting and risky, but letting them stay there was unthinkable. His heart pounded as he made the decision. He would bring them home, no matter what it took. Carefully, he lifted the first woman into his arms. Her small weight made it easier than he expected, though the fear of slipping or falling kept him tense. She was shivering violently, and he wrapped her tightly in the coat, murmuring words he hoped would bring comfort. She did not respond, but he could feel her body gradually stiffening less as he carried her. Turning back for the second woman, he saw her eyelids flicker as she began to stir slightly. Relief mixed with urgency. He had to get both of them to warmth before the cold stole their strength. He moved quickly but cautiously, his boots crunching in the snow. Each step was measured, every movement careful. The trail back to his cabin was narrow, lined with frosted trees that creaked under the weight of the snow. The wind bit at his face and he felt the icy sting on his exposed hands, but he did not let it slow him. He kept talking to them softly, even if they could not understand. Sometimes just hearing a voice could help someone hold on when everything else felt lost. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, he reached his cabin. It was small but sturdy, with a chimney already smoking from the fire he had lit earlier. He placed the first woman gently on a thick blanket on the floor, then moved the second in the same careful manner. He quickly built a fire higher, the warmth beginning to chase away the cold from the room. He fetched water and gave them a little to sip, careful not to overwhelm them. Their bodies were fragile, their mouths barely able to move, but they drank slowly, almost mechanically. Sitting back on his heels, he studied them. They were strangers, clearly from the Apache community, judging by the faint details of their traditional clothing peeking through the rags. He had met Apache families before in town, but these women were alone, and their situation was terrifying. He could not imagine the journey they had taken to end up in this snow-covered isolation. His mind raced with questions. How had they survived so long? And why were they here, completely alone? Though exhausted, he did not allow himself to rest. He checked their breathing again, adjusted the blankets, and sprinkled a little water on a cloth to gently wipe their frozen faces. One of the women moved slightly, her eyes opening just a little more. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. He smiled gently, hoping to give reassurance without words, and kept murmuring soft phrases. She did not speak, only blinked slowly, but it was enough to tell him that life was still fighting within her. Time seemed to slow in the quiet cabin. Outside, the wind howled, but inside there was only the crackling fire and the fragile sound of breathing. The rancher allowed himself a moment to reflect. He had grown up learning about survival in harsh conditions, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of responsibility he felt in this moment. He was not just rescuing these women, he was becoming part of their story, part of the thin thread that would decide whether they lived or died. As the morning turned to afternoon, he stayed by their side, adjusting the fire and checking their pulses. Occasionally the women stirred, mumbling words he could not understand, but it was progress. Each small movement brought relief and hope. He began to imagine the possibilities of what lay ahead, helping them regain strength, finding their families, and keeping them safe from further harm. The reality of the outside world was harsh, but for now, this cabin was a sanctuary. Hours passed, and the women's color slowly returned. Their teeth were no longer chattering uncontrollably, and their eyes began to focus. The rancher could see the faintest signs of recognition and comprehension. He offered them food, simple bread and water, and though they ate slowly, it was a victory. The ordeal of the cold had left marks, but they were alive, and that was what mattered. By evening, he sat back and let himself breathe for the first time. He had made a choice that morning that could have ended in tragedy, but instead, it had brought life. He realized that decisions like these defined who we were, more than comfort, convenience, or safety ever could. He did not know the future, but he knew that something had shifted inside him. This day, this choice, would be remembered not for the cold or the danger, but for the act of compassion that had carried him through. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering the land in a quiet white blanket. Inside, the fire crackled, and two women slept, slowly regaining the strength to continue. The rancher watched them, his heart full of a mixture of pride, relief, and a newfound respect for the resilience of the human spirit. He knew the days ahead would not be easy. He knew there would be questions, challenges, and decisions that required care and patience, but for now, he allowed himself to feel a deep sense of accomplishment. He had acted when it mattered most. He had chosen life, hope, and kindness. And that choice had already begun to change him. And as the night settled in, quiet and heavy with snow, he silently vowed that he would do everything in his power to see these women safe, warm, and alive. Because sometimes, he realized, it only takes one choice, one decision made in a moment of courage, to change the course of not just another person's life, but your own. The morning after the rescue, the rancher woke to the soft light filtering through the frosted windows. The fire had burned low overnight, leaving a faint warmth in the cabin, and the snow outside reflected the pale sunlight, making the room feel bright despite the cold. He checked the two women again, careful not to disturb them too much. They were both still resting, but their breathing seemed steadier than the night before. A quiet sense of relief washed over him, though he knew the hardest part was still ahead. He moved around the cabin silently, preparing for the day. He brought water, some simple food, and a few extra blankets. His small kitchen smelled faintly of bread and firewood, a comforting reminder that life continued even in difficult times. The women stirred slightly as he approached, their eyes opening slowly. They looked around the room with confusion, unsure of where they were or how they had gotten there. He spoke softly, though he knew they might not understand. "You're safe now," he said. "You're warm, and you're gonna be okay. One of the women attempted to speak, her voice weak and barely audible. The rancher smiled gently and offered her water, helping her sip slowly. She nodded slightly, understanding the gesture even if the words were not clear. It was a small victory, but it was a start. The other woman was still too weak to respond, her body curled under the blankets. He checked her pulse and adjusted her position, careful to avoid causing pain. Each small movement, each little improvement, was a reminder of why he had acted the day before. The rest of the morning passed quietly. The rancher moved around the cabin, tending to the fire and preparing a simple breakfast. He made sure there was extra water nearby and kept an eye on the women, noting every small sign of improvement. They were fragile, but they were alive. He knew that in such situations, patience was as important as immediate action. Rushing could do more harm than good. He allowed them to rest, speaking softly when necessary, offering food and water in small amounts. By midday, the women were starting to show signs of awareness. They looked at him with curiosity, their eyes no longer blank or glazed. The rancher felt a mixture of relief and cautious hope. He began to try simple words, speaking slowly and clearly, while using gestures to indicate meaning. "Eat," he said, pointing to the food. "Drink," he added, showing the water. One of the women managed a small smile and reached for the bread, eating a few pieces carefully. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. He realized that they were both exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The experience they had endured was unimaginable. Lost in the cold, alone, and facing the very real threat of death. He tried not to imagine how scared they must have been, how helpless they must have felt. His own fear and concern had driven him to act, but now he needed to provide comfort and stability. He moved slowly, making sure everything he did was gentle and unhurried. As the day progressed, the rancher noticed small details about them. Their clothes, while worn, hinted at a cultural heritage, a history that was rich and proud. He recognized patterns in the fabric and subtle designs that were traditional to Apache women. He realized that they had come from somewhere far, that they were not from his immediate area. He felt a deeper sense of responsibility. These women were strangers in a harsh land, and he was the only person who could help them navigate the next steps safely. He spent hours with them, offering quiet companionship. He told them about the cabin, about the animals outside, and about the land. Even if they could not understand all his words, the tone and care in his voice provided reassurance. Occasionally, he would bring them closer to the fire, showing them how to hold their hands near it without burning themselves. He demonstrated simple ways to stay warm, using blankets and clothing, explaining gestures patiently. By late afternoon, one of the women began to speak a few words in a soft, hesitant voice. It was not perfect, but it was enough for the rancher to understand the basics. She was asking for food and water, and he helped her with both. Her companion began to show more signs of consciousness, blinking, adjusting her position, and slowly taking in her surroundings. Each small action was a reminder of the power of care, patience, and human connection. The rancher realized that trust was being built, not through words alone, but through consistent actions.
Every time he brought food, every time he checked on them, every time he offered warmth and comfort, he was teaching them that they were safe.
He understood that trust could not be rushed, and that it was fragile, especially for people who had faced danger and hardship. He made a silent promise to himself that he would do everything possible to protect them, to give them the chance to recover fully. As the evening approached, he prepared a small meal for himself, sitting near them while they ate. He noticed how carefully they handled the food, how each bite was taken with thoughtfulness and care. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, a contrast to the chaos and fear of the previous day. He felt a growing sense of connection with them, a realization that this experience was changing him as much as it was helping them. Night came slowly, and the cold outside grew sharper. The rancher refilled the fire, making sure it would last through the night. He helped the women settle under the blankets, adjusting their positions for warmth and comfort. He sat nearby, alert and watchful, ready to respond if they needed anything. He reflected on the day, on the choice he had made, and on how much impact one decision could have. Finding them in the cold had been unexpected, but choosing to help them had created a path for healing and trust. During the night, he noticed subtle movements from the women. One stirred, murmuring quietly, while the other shifted slightly under the blankets. Their breathing was stronger, more regular. He allowed himself a quiet moment of relief, knowing that the recovery process had begun in earnest. It would not be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but the first steps had been taken. By the next morning, the women were able to sit up, supported by the rancher. They began to eat a proper breakfast, their strength slowly returning. He guided them carefully, showing them how to handle the food and water safely, how to keep warm, and how to take care of themselves in a small but meaningful way. The atmosphere in the cabin was changing from one of fear and desperation to one of cautious hope and rebuilding. Throughout the day, small moments of humor and connection began to appear. One of the women tried to imitate the rancher's gestures when he demonstrated how to hold the blankets around themselves. She smiled shyly and he smiled back, understanding that laughter, even small, was a sign of healing. These moments, simple as they were, strengthened the bond between them. Trust was growing alongside their physical recovery. By the end of the day, the rancher felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had not only saved 2 lives from the cold, but had begun to build a relationship based on care, respect, and trust. He understood that the process of recovery was ongoing, and that each day would bring new challenges, but he was ready. He was determined to ensure that these women were safe and that they would eventually be able to return to their lives, stronger and more confident. As night fell once again, he sat by the fire, listening to the soft breathing of the women as they slept peacefully under the blankets. He reflected on the events of the past 2 days, realizing that this experience had changed him. He had acted in a moment of crisis, and in doing so, he had discovered a deeper sense of compassion, patience, and responsibility. The connection he felt with these strangers was real, and it was growing stronger with each passing moment. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. He would have to help them regain full strength, communicate more effectively, and plan for their safe return to family or community. But for now, the rancher allowed himself to feel a quiet pride in the work he had done. He had chosen to help, and in choosing, he had begun a journey of trust, care, and human connection that would shape the lives of everyone involved. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering the land in a soft white blanket. Inside, the cabin was warm, filled with a quiet sense of life renewed and hope restored. The rancher looked at the 2 women now resting comfortably and realized that the choice he had made was more than an act of kindness. It was a turning point for all of them. And as he watched the fire flicker and the snow continue to fall, he understood that some decisions made in the cold and in urgency had the power to change lives forever. The journey was just beginning, but the bond had been formed and the path toward recovery and trust had been set. By the next morning, the rancher noticed that both women were showing clear signs of improvement. Their faces, once pale and lifeless, now carried a faint color, and their eyes moved with curiosity and awareness. He could see that the cold, which had nearly claimed them, was slowly leaving their bodies. He felt a wave of relief, but also a sense of responsibility heavier than before. He knew that physical recovery was only the beginning. Emotional healing and trust would take longer. He entered the cabin quietly, careful not to startle them. They were sitting near the fire wrapped in blankets, watching the flames flicker with a mixture of fascination and caution. One of the women glanced at him, then smiled faintly, a small, hesitant gesture, but meaningful. He nodded, offering a reassuring smile in return. It was a silent agreement, a simple understanding that they were safe here, that they could trust him. He prepared breakfast slowly, knowing that they were still weak and needed nourishment in small portions. He offered each of them a plate, placing it gently in front of them. The women ate carefully, their movements slow but deliberate. While they were quiet, the rancher sensed their minds were active, processing the situation, trying to understand their surroundings and the man who had saved them. He knew words were limited, but actions could communicate far more. After breakfast, he decided it was time to try simple communication exercises. He had noticed that one of the women seemed more willing to respond to gestures and objects. He pointed to the water and said, "Drink," then handed it to her. She looked at him, hesitated for a moment, then sipped carefully. He nodded and smiled, repeating the gesture with the other woman. Slowly, they began to understand that he was there to help, to provide guidance, and to ensure their safety. The rancher realized that trust was being built not only through care but also through routine. He established a simple schedule for the day: rest, food, warmth, and small walks near the cabin. The women began to follow the rhythm of his instructions, learning that consistency and patience were part of their recovery. Each small success brought hope, not just for them, but for him as well. He could feel their confidence returning, like a fragile flame flickering to life after being nearly extinguished. As the day went on, the women began to share more through gestures, pointing to objects and nodding or shaking their heads. The rancher understood some words, while others remained a mystery. Yet communication, even partial, strengthened the bond between them. He realized that connection did not always require complete understanding. Sometimes it was enough to care consistently, to show empathy through action and presence. By midday, the women were ready for a short walk outside. The rancher helped them out of the cabin, supporting them as they stepped onto the snow-covered land. The cold wind was still sharp, but with proper clothing and support, they managed to walk slowly around the yard. The women looked around, noticing the fences, the animals, and the wide expanse of snow. Their eyes were filled with wonder and caution, taking in the new environment carefully. During the walk, the rancher showed them the horses in the nearby pen. He explained, through gestures and simple words, that the animals were gentle and could provide warmth and companionship. One of the women reached out tentatively to touch a horse's nose, her hand trembling slightly. The animal nudged her gently, and she smiled for the first time, a bright, genuine expression of joy and curiosity. The rancher felt his heart lift. These small moments of connection were as important as physical recovery. Returning to the cabin, he guided them through basic self-care. He showed them how to handle blankets, how to drink water safely, and how to rest properly without losing body heat. The women followed his instructions carefully, their movements becoming more confident and deliberate with each passing hour. They asked questions through gestures and simple words, and he responded patiently, ensuring that they felt understood and respected. As evening approached, he decided to share more about himself, hoping to deepen the connection. He told them, slowly and clearly, about his life on the ranch, the work he did with animals, and his daily routines. Even if they could not understand every word, they listened intently, their eyes reflecting curiosity and growing trust. He realized that sharing a part of himself helped them feel more comfortable, more willing to open up in their own ways. The women began to share fragments of their story as well. Through gestures, drawings in the snow, and broken words, they indicated that they had been traveling and had become lost. The rancher understood that they had faced danger and exhaustion, which explained their weakened state. He listened without judgment, offering reassurance through nods, smiles, and gestures. Each shared detail strengthened the bond, creating a fragile but growing sense of understanding and empathy. Night came slowly, and the rancher prepared a simple dinner. They ate together near the fire, the warmth of the flames reflecting in their eyes. He noticed how much more alert and interactive they had become since the day before. They laughed quietly at small gestures, exchanged looks, and even tried to mimic his movements. These small moments of joy were a sign that healing was occurring, not just of the body, but of the spirit. After dinner, he guided them through another short exercise. He showed them how to make simple signals for water, food, and warmth, so they could communicate basic needs without confusion. The women practiced carefully, and he encouraged them with nods and smiles. It was a practical step, but also a symbolic one. They were regaining control over their environment, and he was helping them do it safely. As the night deepened, he watched them settle under the blankets. They were calm and peaceful, no longer trembling uncontrollably from the cold or fear. He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that their trust in him was growing, and that they were beginning to regain their strength. He reflected on how far they had come in just a few days, and how much courage it took to survive such hardship and still begin to heal. The rancher realized that recovery was not just about warmth and food. It was about creating a safe, consistent environment where trust could flourish. Every action he took, from tending the fire to offering gentle words and gestures, contributed to this sense of security. The women were responding to his care, and he was learning to respond to their needs, even when words were limited. It was a dance of patience, empathy, and understanding, each movement building the foundation of a lasting bond. During the night he heard small murmurs from the women as they slept. They shifted slightly, spoke softly in broken phrases, and occasionally reached for the blankets he had arranged. He understood that these were signs of adjustment, of adaptation to the safety and warmth he had provided. He smiled quietly, knowing that even unconscious actions could reflect trust and growing comfort. By the next morning, the women were able to perform basic tasks independently, such as holding a cup of water or adjusting their blankets. They walked more steadily and began to respond more clearly to his gestures and words. The rancher felt a deep sense of pride, not for himself, but for their resilience and courage. He recognized that they had endured unimaginable hardship, yet they were now taking active steps toward recovery and self-reliance. Throughout the day, he continued to teach them practical skills, always with patience and encouragement. He showed them how to start a fire safely, how to recognize signs of cold exhaustion, and how to communicate basic needs. The women absorbed these lessons quickly, their confidence growing with each successful attempt. It was a slow process, but each step forward was a victory. By evening, the cabin was filled with a sense of warmth, not just from the fire, but from the growing connection between them. The women laughed quietly at small jokes, shared glances of understanding, and even offered gestures of appreciation. The rancher felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that his efforts were making a real difference. Trust had been established, and a bond had begun to form, a bond that would carry them through the challenges still to come. As night fell, he reflected on the events of the past several days. He had discovered that patience, consistency, and compassion were as powerful as any physical aid. He had learned that trust could be built even in the most difficult circumstances, and that the smallest gestures could have the greatest impact. The women were no longer strangers. They were survivors, individuals whose lives he had touched in a profound way, and whose trust he had earned through action, not words alone. And as he watched the fire flicker and the snow fall silently outside, he understood that the journey of healing was ongoing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to deepen the bond they had formed. But for now, he allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of hope and satisfaction, knowing that the women were stronger, safer, and beginning to reclaim their lives. The next morning dawned crisp and quiet, the sunlight reflecting softly on the snow-covered land. The rancher woke early, as was his habit, and moved quietly around the cabin, checking the fire and preparing breakfast. He could hear gentle movements from the two women, now fully awake and beginning to adjust to their surroundings. It was remarkable to see how far they had come in just a few days. The change was not only physical but also emotional. Their eyes now held clarity, curiosity, and a growing sense of trust. As he set the table with simple food, he felt the mix of pride and reflection. The days they had shared were extraordinary. He had found them on the edge of life, frozen and weak, and now they were capable of small tasks, laughing softly at minor jokes and even engaging in gestures that felt like conversation. Their resilience amazed him. He had witnessed the human spirit at its strongest, and he felt humbled to have played a role in their recovery. After breakfast, he guided them outside for another short walk. The sun was brighter now, and the snow sparkled like diamonds under its rays. The women moved with more confidence, their steps sure and balanced. He pointed out the animals in the pens, letting them observe the horses and the small herd of cattle from a safe distance. They reached out to touch the animals carefully, learning to judge the gentle nature of the creatures through observation and touch. The women's faces lit up with joy and wonder, and the rancher felt a warmth in his chest at the sight of their growing comfort. Once back inside, he encouraged them to rest, knowing that physical activity, even small, was important but had to be balanced with recovery. He poured water and offered bread, watching as they ate independently, their gestures showing both understanding and gratitude. He noticed subtle expressions of emotion. One woman smiled at him while the other, more reserved, gave a small nod. Trust, he realized, had been established not through words alone, but through care, consistency, and patience. Later that morning, he decided to address what lay ahead. He had been silent about their future, unsure how they would proceed once they regained full strength. Now it was time to discuss their next steps. Using gestures, pointing to a map he drew in the snow outside and speaking slowly and clearly, he helped them understand that they would need to find safety with family or community. The women listened intently, their expressions serious. The rancher realized that even with growing trust, leaving would be a difficult choice. He offered options. They could stay temporarily at the cabin until it was safe to travel, or he could help them reach a nearby town where relatives might be waiting. He emphasized that he would help them regardless of their choice. The women whispered to each other in soft, broken phrases, pointing to the cabin, then to the map. Finally, after a long moment, they nodded toward the cabin, indicating that they wished to stay a little longer until they felt fully ready. The rancher agreed, understanding that patience was part of the journey and that their decision reflected both caution and trust in him. The following days were filled with quiet routine and small lessons. The women regained more strength, learning how to handle basic tasks, care for themselves in cold weather, and even assist in simple chores around the cabin. The rancher guided them patiently, ensuring every step was safe and comfortable. Their laughter began to appear more frequently, their smiles more genuine, and their interactions more natural. He realized that they were no longer simply recovering, they were adapting, growing stronger, and beginning to feel a sense of empowerment. During these days, the bond between them deepened. They began to share fragments of stories, gestures, and words, describing journeys, family, and experiences that had led them to this harsh land. The rancher listened without judgment, offering support and encouragement through every small action. He understood that their past had been difficult, filled with challenges and danger, and that his role was not to question it but to provide safety and guidance. Each shared detail strengthened their connection, creating a quiet but unbreakable bond. One afternoon, as the women helped him organize blankets and firewood, the rancher paused to observe them. They were no longer timid or fearful. Their movements were steady, confident, and careful, and they shared small jokes and laughter as they worked. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment and pride, not for himself but for their resilience and courage. They had faced near death, yet they were alive, strong, and beginning to trust again. This realization brought him a profound sense of peace. As evening approached, the rancher prepared a simple dinner. They sat together near the fire, eating quietly but comfortably. The atmosphere was warm, not just from the flames, but from the growing connection between them. They shared small smiles, gestures of gratitude, and even moments of gentle humor. It was a moment of harmony, a quiet celebration of life, recovery, and the bonds that hardship could create. He understood that this was the heart of their journey: trust, care, and shared human experience. That night, the women slept peacefully under warm blankets, no longer trembling or fearful. The rancher sat by the fire, reflecting on the days that had passed. He thought about the morning he had found them nearly frozen, the fear and urgency that had driven him to act, and the countless small decisions he had made since. He realized that his life had been irrevocably changed, not by danger or fear, but by the simple choice to help. That one act of compassion had brought him into contact with strength, courage, and humanity at its finest. The following morning brought clarity. The women were ready to consider the next steps seriously. The rancher used simple gestures, pointing to the path toward town, and explained that relatives might be waiting. He reassured them that he would accompany them partway if needed, that their safety was his responsibility until they were truly secure. After a quiet conversation, they nodded toward the path but paused to look at the cabin one last time. It had been their shelter, their sanctuary, and the place where trust had been built. The rancher understood the emotions in their eyes: gratitude, hesitation, and the recognition that this chapter of their journey was coming to an end. When the day came for them to leave, the rancher helped them pack their belongings. He carried heavier items, guided them safely through the snow, and ensured that they were dressed warmly for the journey. The women moved steadily, but their hands occasionally brushed his, small gestures of appreciation and connection. He smiled, understanding that their choice to leave was also a choice of trust. They trusted him to guide them safely, and in doing so, they were honoring the bond they had formed. As they walked toward the distant town, he reflected on how much this experience had changed him. He had faced fear and uncertainty, yet had acted without hesitation. In doing so, he had discovered a deeper understanding of patience, empathy, and human resilience. The women, too, had been transformed. They were no longer simply survivors, but individuals reclaiming control over their lives with strength, dignity, and hope. Before parting ways, the women turned to him, offering gestures and words of gratitude. Their smiles were bright and genuine, their eyes filled with trust and respect. The rancher felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He realized that the connection they had formed would remain with him forever, a reminder of the power of compassion and the profound impact of a single choice. They had changed each other's lives, not through grand gestures, but through simple acts of care, patience, and understanding. As he watched them walk away, safely guided toward family and community, he felt a mixture of pride, relief, and quiet joy. He knew that his life would never be the same. That cold morning when he had found them nearly frozen in the snow had seemed ordinary at first, but it had become extraordinary. The choice to act, to help, had created ripples of change that would last far longer than the brief moments of crisis. Returning to the cabin, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, not in the sense of accomplishment, but in the sense of human connection and shared experience. The world outside was still cold and harsh, but inside him, warmth and compassion had taken root. He realized that life was shaped not by the challenges we face alone, but by how we respond to the needs of others, how we act in moments that demand courage and empathy. And so, the rancher continued his days as before, checking fences, caring for animals, and tending to his land. Yet he carried within him a new understanding, a quiet transformation born from the simple act of helping two women in need. Their lives had been saved, their trust earned, and in the process, his own perspective on life, compassion, and human connection had been forever changed. The snow continued to fall softly over the land, covering everything in white silence. But inside the rancher there was a warmth that no cold could touch, a warmth born from the knowledge that a single act of kindness had created life, trust, and hope. And he knew that he would never forget the day he found two nearly dead Apache women in the cold, or the choice he had made, which had changed all of their lives forever.